right. Hey, what's up? This is a redo of a previous live stream we did on not Hebrews, Second Corinthians 3. And because previously we did do the stream itself, but we didn't have time to answer questions. And obviously, you might not have actually been there to ask your questions. So, you're free to do it after this presentation. It's pretty longer than the others. But I'm going to try to go through it quickly enough. But just as a little heads up, next week I actually won't be doing another part of the series. There's still more to do. But next week I'm going to go into a paper that I wrote. I'm going to present it at the Layman Seminary over here, same time. And we're going to go into something I wrote, and then we're going to continue with the series afterward. All right. And hey, Jace, what's up? If you have questions, you're free to ask them during it. I'll just read them afterward. But let me just check something. Okay. All right, we're good. So, ministers of a new covenant. You see the guy with the heart there. You see the words written on his heart, right? What does that mean? 2 Corinthians 3:6. So this is the 7th installment and the 3rd edition, where we carefully exegete relevant New Covenant texts. So, the New Covenant is kind of a big deal for dispensationalism, because if there's overlap between the church and Israel's covenants, have we built our entire system on a sandy foundation? Now, kind of like Hebrews, 2 Corinthians 3:6 has been a battleground passage for the last few decades in dealing with this issue, and it's a pretty good reason, right? So I would say that from a lot of the scholars you see, it might be the most quoted text to prove we're under the new covenant. Now, there are others. 1 Corinthians 11 is a good one people use, and we've already proved that that's not the case. That's not what's going on in that passage. But 2 Corinthians 3 definitely is the most proven text for upholding that position. Now, like we did with Romans 11, right, and we went into the context, Romans 9 to 11, we're going to look at the book as a whole, right, in order to get an overview of this one passage. And so, as we said before, you can only understand these passages dispensationally. And of course, all credit belongs to the original authors, the author of this section, whose name is George Gunn, and the general editor, Christopher Cone. So, this is the 5 views of the New Covenant. You probably subconsciously, even in your casual study, have lined up with one of these views, and as well as on 2 Corinthians 3:6. So we're going to briefly go over them like we've done before. Replacement theology believes that the church entirely fulfills the new covenant. National ethnic Israel has been superseded by the church. That's supersessionism, or replacement theology, but they don't like that name, which is the true spiritual Israel. The church ministers the new covenant by fulfilling the Great Commission, and the Great Commission is Matthew 28, 19 to 20, after Christ's resurrection. Dispensational view number 1 says that the church, by fulfilling the Great Commission, accomplishes a partial fulfillment of the new covenant. Now, of course, there's fulfillment in part and partial fulfillment. They're not necessarily the same. But that distinction is important because this is more of a progressive view. It's a partial fulfillment of the new covenant, but the ultimate fulfillment awaits the renewal of national Israel in the millennium. Dispensational view number 2 says that the church does not partially fulfill the new covenant. They fulfill it in part, but they do participate in some of the blessings that we call them as spiritual blessings, however you want to locate that. Usually forgiveness of sins and indwelling of the Holy Spirit and regeneration. Dispensational view number 3 says, this is more Louis Berry Schaeffer's view, the church has its own new covenant that is distinct from what will be established with the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 for Israel. And the church, therefore, ministers its own new covenant via the Great Commission. Dispensational view number 4 says the church is not directly related to the new covenant in any way, but it is related to the mediator and the blood of the new covenant. It does not participate in any of the blessings of the new covenant directly, although it does receive blessings from the Abrahamic covenant, which Christ also fulfills. And it especially does not minister the new covenant in the Great Commission. And so that's my personal view. That's also the view of the authors. That's called Single Covenant Israel only. Now, if we want to organize these views, we can categorize them in one of two ways. One, we can say covenant theology, view number one. And then the views 2 to 5, the four views, are the dispensational views. Or we can categorize it as views 1 to 4 says the church has some participation in the new covenant. And the last view says the church has no participation in the new covenant. So it's kind of a minority, as you'll see. And from here on, we're going to refer to these 5 views as replacement, partial fulfillment, participation, 2 covenants, and no relationship. So just as an overview, basically we have 5 views, 1 from covenant theology, 4 from dispensationalism. One says the church fully fulfills it because they're the new Israel. Another says the church partially fulfills it, right? Another says the church participates in some blessings, so it's fulfillment in part. Another view says that there are 2 covenants, right? So the church has its own new covenant. And the third view is no, we don't participate in it at all, and we don't have our own covenant, right? Now, this is where it gets kind of tricky, and this is going to be the most convoluted slide of them all, but it's necessary to establish some things. We have to establish who believes what. So Darby is held to be the first systematizer of dispensational thought in the 1900s, and most people say he held to the no relationship view, but is this entirely accurate? J.D. Pentecost says in Things to Come that the gospel is not a covenant, but the revelation of the salvation of God. This is again what Darby wrote. It proclaims the great salvation. We enjoy indeed all the essential privileges of the new covenant, its foundation being laid on God's part in the blood of Christ, but we do so in the spirit, not according to the letter. The new covenant will be established formally with Israel in the millennium. Now, there's a lot of interesting language there. I don't exactly know what he means by this. What does he mean by established formally? Is there an informal establishment versus a formal one? He says we do it in the spirit, but not in the letter. Is there a way to do it in the letter, right? That Israel's going to do? I'm not exactly sure. However, I think if you take all of Darby into consideration, you'll probably see that he aligns more with the no relationship view, which is single covenant Israel only. So we're just going to roll with that for now. Early on, Ryrie and Walvoord held to the two covenants view, if you can believe that. But later on, because of criticism, they moved on into the direction of the participation view, the participation of not fulfilling it, but fulfillment in part, which is modern dispensationalism. And progressive dispensationalists like Bruce Ware, Craig Blazing, they hold to the partial fulfillment view, which is view number 2. And now up front, the no relationship view is, in my opinion, the most textually supported from the Old Testament, and it maintains the consistent distinction between Israel and the church. However, this is not about what I like. It's not about what I prefer. It's about what's actually exegetical, what's grounded in the text. And so basically we have a lot of progressives like the partial fulfillment. Most dispensationalists hold to the view number 3, which is the fulfillment in part or participation. Basically, no dispensationalist holds to the two covenants, and we personally prefer at least I personally prefer the Israel only. Now, I actually got these 2 images from searching online of the different things, the different charts that people have. So on the top you have dispensationalism, and on the bottom you have amillennialism. You got all the sophistication, you got the age of grace, the church, the kingdom, the 7-year tribulation, you got the Ezekiel's temple, and then you just got amillennialism. Keep it simple, stupid. So what's the significance of 2 Corinthians 3:6? Now, just as a note, almost every other New Covenant reference in the New Testament is either in an eschatological or Jewish context. Specifically, the New Covenant mentions almost always refer to a future messianic period of people obeying and glorifying God through their obedience. If we allow 2 Corinthians 3:6, right, this one text, to present a fulfillment of that, then we kind of have to call all those other scriptures into question and how we interpret them. And at that point, why not just go to the bottom one and become an amillennialist? Okay. And so progressives place great significance on this verse as well. And so Paul Thorsel states that it presents a, quote, formidable reason to regard the new covenant as partially fulfilled or inaugurated. However, is he accurate in this assertion? Have we jumped the gun and didn't look at the full context of what Paul actually said in these verses? So, I mean, this basically the second Corinthians 3:6 is a big deal. Like I pointed out, it's a battleground, and so we gotta take this seriously when we exegete it. So we're gonna answer 6 questions that George Gunn poses in this chapter, so we can comprehend Paul's argument. Question 1 is ministers of a new covenant, which in the Greek is diakonos kaines diathekes, an objective or descriptive genitive? Number 2, what is the referent to us, himas? Question 3, what is the context of this statement? I can't make it clearer. Question 4, is there significance to the fact that diathekes or covenant is anarthrous? Question 5, what was the state of theological development when Paul wrote 2 Corinthians? How well developed was Paul's concept of the church as an entity separate and distinct from Israel? And question 6, why would Paul be referring to a passage from the Hebrew scriptures when addressing a largely Gentile church? So we're going to go through 6 of these questions as we go over the study. And hopefully we'll be able to formulate our answers by the end of it so that we can get to Paul's statement here. Right, but we're going to keep bringing up these questions as we go on. Now, the first one, you've got a guy with a mask, right? You're probably asking, like, okay, why does he have a mask? Well, the first question is it an objective or descriptive genitive? And so this is probably the most fundamental question that we have to answer for the rest of the study. If it's objective, then we can phrase it as those who minister the new covenant. In other words, the new covenant is the content of their ministry. However, if we take it as descriptive, then it would be phrased as a new covenant-like ministry, and that's more of Kurt's view. And this would lead less to the content of what Paul was ministering, but the character and conduct of it. And we're going to go talk more about that later. Now, of course, the closest parallel of the genitive using ministers is actually 2 Corinthians 11:15, and it says ministers of righteousness. So, of course, these people are masquerading, right? Like the guy on the left, he's masquerading as someone else, as a minister of righteousness. So they don't actually administer righteousness, but they present or conduct themselves as righteously. And so this is clearly a genitive of description, kind of like the angel of light or the angelus photon, right? However, just because it's parallel structure doesn't necessarily mean that it's identical. So we have to seek other exegetical ground for our conclusions. So this is the main question that we're meant to answer. All the other 5 questions are meant to answer this. If it's objective, then we can say, okay, we are ministering the new covenant with the gospel and that kind of stuff. But if it's descriptive, well, that would more support our view, right? That's the point. Now, the question number 2 is who is the us of the sentence, right? You got Spider-Man pointing at himself with all of these characters, right? He's saying, okay, who are you talking about? Well, most people see the us in this passage is the all Christians, right? So therefore, by preaching the gospel, we administer the blessings of the new covenant, like the forgiveness of sins, to unbelievers. And so this coincides pretty well with an objective genitive view. However, who is included in the first person plural of us? Well, number 1, it could reference Paul alone, and so it merely assumes an editorial first person plural. Number 2, it could reference Paul and Timothy, and possibly Titus as he's joining along with the team, right? He's just there along for the ride. It could specifically be about Paul and the Corinthians as fellow laborers, like in 2 Corinthians 6:1. Number 4, it could reference the apostles as a total in inaugurating the new covenant, although that's probably less likely since he doesn't include all of the apostles in his other addresses. And number 5, it could reference all believers, like we just said initially, right? So we're basically answering who is has made us ministers of a new covenant. What is that referencing here? And there's like 5 views to keep track of, but I think it'll be pretty clear what the actual options are as we go on. So continuing on, we have to note some of the first person indicators in chapters 1-3 that are worth noting, right? And he often switches between I and me, we and us, that kind of stuff. So in verses 1-13a, the comforts us includes Paul and Timothy, obviously. But those who are comforted is probably talking about the Corinthians, so it makes a distinction. Verse 13b starts as we write nothing else and then switches to make it personal. I hope you will understand, right? Now 1:14 says is a return to the default plural that Paul used since verse 1. 1:15 to 1:17 is a singular, right? So Paul switches to the singular to tell of his personal past canceled plans to visit Corinth. Now, up to this point, the plural had been the default, but now he primarily goes to the singular. In this, we have 1:18 to 22, which is a return to the plural, which references specifically Paul, Silas, and Timothy. So he tells us who he's talking about. Verse 123, as with 15 to 17, this is a past reference to his canceled plans to visit Corinth. You see in 124, this is a return to the plural with a gnomic time frame, right? We lord it over, you stand firm, right? These are just general timeless truths, nothing specific here. 1 to 10 is just more canceled plans like in the previous ones. 2:11 is just a general statement applicable to all. That's not really worth noting. 12 to 13 is a default singular. Paul again discusses his past plans. And 14 to 3:6 is a plural again, where he describes a series of metaphors for his ministry. Now, the reason for the switch to the plural here compared to 2:11 is different. So the first person plural in 3:3 is clearly in contrast to the second person plural, right? So they're not the same here. And no such contrast is given in 2:11. Therefore, the use of the plural in this section is to depict the ministry as conducted specifically by Timothy, Titus, and Paul, in contrast with the false teachers. And so this, more like the previous question, supports the conclusion that of a new covenant is a genitive of description. And so basically, we're just going over the plural, the singular, the exegetical stuff, and we're concluding, look, from the context, it seems to be that he's talking about his personal ministry and team, not about all Christians, right? Because that's how he used it before in the previous verses. Now, we get to our third question, right? What's the context? The most important question of exegesis is context, context, context. Those are the three rules. Now, two contextual issues affect the interpretation of 2 Corinthians 3:6. Number one is the literary style, and number two is the topic that he's discussing. Now, first, discussing the literary style, a major theme that most commentators recognize is that 2 Corinthians is actually a defense of Paul's ministry in the face of like 1,000 criticisms, right? And these criticisms probably stem from Paul's initial failure to visit Corinth as planned, and then more of them stemmed out from perceptions about his conduct, right? And then from 2:14 to 5:5, if you didn't know this, Paul actually uses 8. I forgot how to count with my hands. He uses 8 metaphors to explain the way he conducts himself, right, as a minister of a new covenant. And most of them are based off of Old Testament imagery. And it's possible that they might all be from Jeremiah 30 to 31 or 32, right? So the first 4 images is the triumphal procession. You see that with the image of a Roman procession. You have the odor of life and death, right? You have that's probably the best I could get from Google Images. I'm going to be real with you on that. It's just a good contrast. The letters written on stone versus the letters written on your heart. Right? And again, another cheesy image. And the new covenant ministers, which is what Paul is. Right? The veil is removed. It's a bride. Now, in the context, it's actually not talking about a bride, but this is the best I could find about a veil being removed. Number 6 is the light of creation in 4:6. Number 7 is earthen vessels in 4:7, which is just vessels containing like gold and precious stones in it, right? Treasure in earthen vessels. And number 8 is the earthly versus the heavenly house, right? Now, you're probably asking, okay, that's great and all, but what does it actually mean? So just a brief overview, metaphors 3 to 8 seem to appear specifically from Jeremiah 31 to 32. And so some problems arise with the first and second, however, because there's nothing explicitly in Jeremiah to suggest it. It's possible it could come from the Babylonians leading away the Israelites to captivity, some of them going to death, others awaiting future restoration, right? You have that life and death, life to life, death to death imagery. But it's possible that Paul also just had in mind the contemporary Roman victory processions, right? The third and fourth metaphors are clearly drawn from Jeremiah 31 New Covenant passages. The 5th and 6th metaphors are reference to the Mosaic law and the veil over Moses that blocked the light of God's glory. The 7th metaphor probably comes from the clay jar symbolism of Jeremiah 32, 10 to 14. You don't have to read that right now. We'll get into that later, what that means. The 8th metaphor could be taken from the houses destroyed by the Babylonians and later rebuilt under the new covenant, which is in the millennium, in Jeremiah 32 and 42 to 44. right? So basically, we're just going over some of the imagery here, explaining the literary style of what Paul is doing, so that we can establish, okay, well, why does he talk about the new covenant? What's relevant to that, right? And we have 8 metaphors that he uses. Now, here's what it doesn't mean, okay? What it doesn't mean is fulfillment. What it is similarity, right? That's what a metaphor is. A metaphor doesn't indicate you fulfill something, it means it's similar to something. It's a contrast or a comparison. For instance, he says, "You are our letter written on our hearts." He's clearly not saying that Jeremiah's prophecy of the law written on the heart of Israel is fulfilled, because number one, it's not. And number two, God's law is God's law. It's not God's people, right? Jeremiah's imagery is a good metaphor to help describe his ministry. However, the inability to discern gospel ministry is kind of like the veil that covered Moses' faith. But that doesn't mean the veil is fulfilled by Paul's opponents, right? Like, that veil is specifically not necessarily fulfilled by every unbelieving Jew. And the same way, the new covenant is a suitable metaphor, right, to describe Paul's ministry against the criticisms of it. However, to understand the point of these metaphors, we have to understand the topic of this section. So we've gone over what the metaphors mean, what they don't mean, what they are, right? And the literary style of why Paul is doing that. But now, okay, well, what's the topic of this section? B, topic. And if you've seen John Wick, right, you know that you got Keanu Reeves and he's surrounded by a bunch of guns. That's kind of like what Paul is doing. He literally says we're persecuted on every side, but not forsaken. And that's kind of what is happening here with his criticism, right? Now, for instance, we have to answer, who are Paul's opponents? What is his defense of his ministry? Why does he argue the way that he does in this section, right? And now, how you identify the opponents has a serious impact on the meaning of 2 Corinthians 3:6. Most people like to say, well, it's just Judaizers, right? And they go to Galatians and other passages, or Philippians 3, to prove, oh, yeah, it's about Judaizers. And so if you see it as opponents equals Judaizers, then you could say, well, they're trying to enforce Mosaic legislation, and therefore we have the new covenant as a replacement to that, right? Now, that sounds simple, but there's actually 19 different interpretations of who the opponents are in 2 Corinthians. And now in chapters 1 to 9, the focus is on the Corinthian congregation criticism, right? Criticisms from within. And that's more of like a Greek philosophical worldview. And so if it's Greek philosophical, then the issue is not about content. It's about conduct, which again favors the descriptive genitive. And the outsiders are only dealt with in verses 11 to 13. Now, 10 is kind of a mix of the two. But basically, the idea is understanding who the opponents are will help you understand what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 3:6, and whether it's objective or descriptive. Now, of course, what about the second group, right? So a Judaizing background for the second group would be, a good proof of that would be 11:4, right? Where it says another gospel, same thing in Galatians 1:6. And that's talking about Judaizers. And so it also talks about that in 11:22. Are they Hebrews? Are they Israelites? Right? However, that doesn't necessarily reinforce a Judaizing background, but it is a Jewish background, right? And so, in fact, 2 Corinthians 10, which I talked about, helps us identify even further who this group is that he's discussing. In that text, it says that some regarded Paul as walking according to the flesh. And that's talking about a standard of measurement that they use, not talking about him personally living lasciviously or anything like that, right? They use their own flesh, or they use the flesh, right, the outward appearance, as a standard of measurement for Paul's walk, right? And therefore, because of that, they judge him as coming up short, right? He's sick, he's poor, he's ineloquent, he's not a good speaker. However, Paul admits, yeah, I do walk in the sphere of this flesh, but I walk according to a different standard, which is the Spirit, not according to the flesh, right? Like Romans chapter 8 and Galatians chapter 5. And it's probably the case that his second group of critics are of a diaspora Jewish origin. And so they would be influenced by like pagan worldviews, philosophical perspectives, that kind of stuff, similar to the Greeks. And so aided by this is a lack of mention of any Judaizing teaching in Galatians that you see, right? Circumcision, dietary laws, observances, etc. So I don't believe that what's going on here is a Judaizing background, right? It's possible some of them might have been that, but the focus is just on a Jewish background, right? We don't have some of the same teaching that you have in Galatians, where he goes in depth with what they were teaching. Now, that's not the point here. The point is that how did he walk? How did he behave and conduct himself? And so, therefore, okay, we've established that. What does the first group criticize Paul for, right? The Greek philosophers. Well, we have on one side, he failed to visit Corinth as planned. He was not a skilled orator. He was physically weak in presence. He had not been financially successful, and he didn't charge a philosopher's fee. And he had been in numerous hardships and even jail. Now, what's Paul's defense? Well, he masterfully weaves together a series of multiple defenses against all of these accusations, right? Number one, he says he conducted himself with sincerity and purity, not by fleshly wisdom, but by God's grace. He did not make absolute statements of yes, yes, and no, no when it comes to his plans to visit Corinth. He just trusted in God. He even says that God sealed him with the Spirit and anointed his team. He says that the Corinthians are proof of Paul's ministry, even though he doesn't have a physical letter of commendation like a philosopher. Paul was made to be an able minister of a new covenant, not of the letter, which kills, but of the Spirit, which gives life. And so these criticisms, all of them, right, they express a very Greek worldview. And since Paul didn't have what was expected of a successful philosopher, right, therefore they were like, oh, this guy's not serious. We shouldn't take him seriously as an apostle because he's not doing what these other successful philosophers are doing. And they had a fleshly standard of judgment rather than a spiritual standard of judgment, kind of like his Jewish opponents. So what's Paul's reply? It's not the message he preached. That's not the point of it. It's the way he preached it, right? The contrast between the letter and the Spirit is about the conduct of its ministry. Did it operate according to the flesh, or did it operate according to the Spirit? And so if Paul would use the Hebrew scriptures, right, if he would quote some scriptures to support his point, wouldn't it make sense that he uses Jeremiah's new covenant to describe it, right? So the first group criticizing him for conduct, Paul responds back with the new covenant. Why? Because that's how he conducts himself, right? It's similar to the new covenant. So how do we put it all together, right? Well, I'll just read straight through. When we look at it holistically, right, as a series of metaphors, we can understand it this way. Number one, the triumphal procession. Weakness in physical appearance may not meet up with fleshly standards, but like the children of Israel were led away into Babylon, both the godly and ungodly were led away. Therefore, physical appearance is no sign of godliness. Number two, the odor of life and death. The presentation of the captives were accompanied by offering incense to pagan gods. The smell signified life for some, but death for others. So too, while Paul did not physically look well, his message was powerful for those who believed it, and it was death for those who rejected it, right? Although, whether you want to say this is eternal death, experiential death, that's not really the issue there. Right? Letters written on hearts. Paul's critics put great emphasis on the outward appearance in commendatory letters. However, just like the new covenant puts superiority on the internal affairs rather than the outward Mosaic covenant, so too did Paul's commendation come from the transformed lives of the Corinthian believers. 4, the new covenant ministers. The old covenant focused on the outward confirmation to legalistic standards. Don't touch this, don't do that. But Paul's standard was similar to that of the new covenant. His failure to keep a written itinerary in his plan to visit Corinth was because he was sensitive to the Spirit's leading in Acts 16 and God's sovereign direction. Now continuing on. The veil removed. After spending much time in God's presence, Moses reflected God's glory, but the Israelites could not bear it. They requested to see Moses with a veil so as to avoid seeing God's glory. So too did Paul's critics desire to see his fleshly success, his wealth, his desires, right? Him living a good life, him just reigning, okay? But Paul desired to show his unveiled face, right? His true nature, so that they would not see the outward man, which perishes, but the glory of God. Number 2, the light of creation. Glory, light, and appearance are things pertaining to God. They don't pertain to creation. The creation exists to glorify God. So Paul, as a part of God's creation, doesn't seek to be noticed for his appearance, but to give the light of the knowledge of God revealed in Christ Jesus. The earthen vessels. Right before the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah purchased a field of Anathoth, and he placed the deed in a clay jar. It didn't need to be ornamental or costly because the treasure was what was inside. And similarly, Paul's earthen vessel or his physical body, it's ailing, and it's not impressive. But the importance was the message inside, which was a message of hope. Now, the earthly and the heavenly house. The coming of the Babylonians would destroy the cities of Judah just as God promised, but he also promised to rebuild them in the new covenant. And so, in the same way, Paul's body would waste away, it would die and decay. And this would be an embarrassment to the Corinthians, right? Some of them who rejected a resurrection, but it was a symbol of a future glorification. And so when we view the context this way, when we actually take a look at these passages, there's even more reason to suggest the context is about the conduct of his ministry rather than the context. And of course, this again supports the descriptive genitive view, which is what we've been promoting. So we've already gone through all the metaphors. We've already explained what they mean. We've already gone into the literary style and the topic of what he's focusing on. And so considering that, at this point, it just makes sense to consider the descriptive genitive view, right? We already have given 3 reasons, but we should still continue onward. Now we have a 4th question. Is it an anarthrous covenant? The anarthrous Greek is represented in most English translations, and it's with the indefinite a new covenant, although a few present it with an indefinite, which is the new covenant. John Master suggests that the anarthrous construction was used, possibly stressing quality more than identity. Now, if John Master is correct, then this is what we do expect to find in the genitive of description as opposed to an objective genitive. However, Larry Pettigrew counters this by claiming that it more accurately represents the Hebrew origins of Jeremiah, where God says in Jeremiah 31:31-34 that he said, I will make a new covenant. In fact, he says it favors the objective genitive, but I think he's pressing the point too far. So this is kind of like a little thing, right? This is a big scholarship thing. Is it indefinite? Is it definite? I don't think it probably matters, and I think Rodney Decker hits the nail on the head here. It's probably not that big a deal, because twice in the New Testament, Jeremiah's new covenant is referred to using the articular construction. Why would Paul use the articular construction in the first epistle if Pettigrew is correct and then change it up in the second epistle? That doesn't really make sense if they're trying to prove the same thing, right? Now, however, the anarthrous is used in 3 other new covenant references, like Hebrews 8. Rodney Decker suggests that it's more accurate that the phrase in question could be treated as a proper name and a definite, whether articular or anarthrous. And so the most we can say that, right, and I'll admit this, and the author admits this, if the articular had been used, it would not be referring to the quality of his ministry, but if it's anarthrous, it can allow for that, right? So there's a possibility of it. The construction of the phrase is probably irrelevant to our understanding of 2 Corinthians 3. And so basically, this is just a small question, right? How do you take the indefinite versus definite? It's probably nothing, right? Like Rodney Decker says, it could just be treated as a proper name rather than anything. But these are just important things to consider in exegesis. Now, question number 5 is related to theological development, right? Now, of course, I have here the theological development that a lot of people go through. So you start out with lordship, your Amil, and your Calvinist. In other words, you're cooked, right? But then you get a little bit better. You get more gracious, and you actually become sovereign grace. And then you change from Amil to covenant premill. So you at least take the text literally in Revelation 20. But then you change from sovereign grace and realize, you know what? Calvinism has no proof text. It doesn't even make sense. Why should I believe in it? And then you become free grace. And then what's fortunate is that you become covenant premill to progressive dispensationalist, right? But then you just become a regular old dispensationalist. And then most people end at the single covenant multi-user view, right? That's a pretty common one. But then the based one, right? The final level is where you become Israel only. So that's the theological development. Now, the question 5 is, what could they have possibly known, right? What was their theological development? This is probably the most difficult hermeneutical challenge because you have to put yourself in the shoes of the audience. And so we have to understand the sociology and the philosophy of a first century Greco-Roman world as 21st century Christians, right? And so regarding that, what would a first century, second century believer think about the new covenant? Now, for our modern ears, using new covenant language when the church is not participating in a new covenant, it kind of sounds a bit absurd, but it wouldn't have sounded that way for the apostles, right? They saw the preaching to the Gentiles as like a brief interlude in between the second coming. I mean, that's literally what they asked, right? They thought the kingdom was going to come immediately. Acts 1:6, Acts 15, 2 Thessalonians 1. And so they didn't know anything about this 2,000-year span that we call the church coming into existence. And so using the new covenant as a metaphor to describe his ministry at that point would seem more appropriate. But now we kind of want things to be realized in the church because we're impatient and we want to come back, right? It makes sense. And that's fair. But I don't think that that's there's no reason to jump to that conclusion. It's just unnecessary. Basically, what's going on is that Paul is using an appropriate metaphor for his time period, not making a theological statement of when the new covenant is fulfilled. Now, if we go into the life of an apostle, right? Joyce Sims made a song in the 1980s called "Come Into My Life," and that's what we're going to do with probably one of the apostles or the believers. Now, if I were to transport myself 2,000 years ago to the Last Supper, I would find no reason to read into the words of Christ anything about a church or about partial fulfillment or anything like that. I would just simply think, hey, Christ, my master, is talking about the establishment of the Messianic kingdom for Israel and the provision of Jeremiah 31. That's it. That's all he's talking about. And so if I was a member of the Corinthian church by the time of 1 Corinthians 11, I would actually find no reason to see that I personally fulfilled the new covenant, right? And again, we already talked about the Lord's Supper and how that relates. If I was still a member of the church and I wasn't dead by divine discipline by the time of 2 Corinthians, I would find no reason to be convinced of the church's participation for the reasons that we suggested in this study. However, some theologians have unwittingly been influenced by the term New Testament, and that influences their views of the New Covenant, right? So again, we're just trying to transport ourselves into the minds of an apostle. We don't know this exactly, but if we just had no view of the church 2,000 years in the future, I think this is probably what we would come up with. So the idea is testament equals covenant. Now, the word itself, right, the underlying Greek word is diathekes. It doesn't, it means the same thing, right? People translate it testament, people translate it covenant. It's the same exact Greek word. But I think Walvoord's comments kind of push it too far, right? He says, from the very fact that the Bible is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, it is clear that Christianity is fundamentally based on a new covenant brought in by Jesus Christ, right? Now, the actual expression for New Testament comes from Novum Testamentum for the Christian canon, and this was probably first used in the 3rd century by Tertullian or Origen. But prior to this, it was never referred to as that. And so the views of Paul and the Corinthian congregation was definitely not influenced by what title they had on the front of their Christian scriptures, right? I don't know if our connection with this artificial division in the Bible, which technically isn't even starting when the new covenant is ratified. It doesn't even start. It starts in the old covenant when Jesus is born, right? So that's ironic, right? And it's kind of made us read too much into the words of 2 Corinthians 3, kind of like the one Walvoord made. And so it's probably not the case. I'm not saying it is, but I do wonder if that might be the case of what we're doing here, right? It seems a bit irresponsible exegetically. Now, this is the final question. This probably is now it's not the most important question, but it is an important question. We've already noted that most references to the New Testament are eschatological or in Jewish context. So why is there a sudden switch above it? However, this might be, so it's basically like, oh, these guys are Gentiles. Why are you referencing Hebrew scriptures and a Hebrew covenant to be talking about these? To be talking to these people? But that's kind of overstating the case, and that simplifies things too much. Because in Acts 18, where it actually talks about the Corinthian congregation, it says that they came out of the synagogue. And so this would have consisted of both Jews, right, the stock of Israel, and those that fear God, which is cut from Acts 13. And so both would have been acquainted with the Hebrew scriptures pretty well. And if you're learning from the synagogues, even as an adult, you know the Hebrew scriptures being taught to you. In fact, Paul makes many quotations to the Old Testament in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. The general formula and ways Paul used both can be contrasted. So basically, there's no reason to say, oh, well, he's referencing a Hebrew covenant to the Gentiles because we're under that covenant. No, that's not what's going on, because they would have known the Hebrew scriptures, right? Some of them even would have been Jews or God-fearing Gentiles, right? Proselytes, possibly. So it's really oversimplifies things, right, to ask that question. In 1 Corinthians, you have, and I'm going to butcher the Greek here because I'm not great at this. It says, "Gegreptai gar, for it is written. Kathos gegreptai, just as it is written. Gar, for. En gar to Moses nomo gegreptai, for it is written in the law of Moses. hosper gegreptai, as it is written, en to nomo gegreptai hoti, in the law it is written that, hotoskai gegreptai, thus also it is written, tote genestai hologos ha gegremenos, then the word which was written will come to pass. Now, in 2 Corinthians, what do we see? We have katako gegremenon, according to what is written, legegar, for it says, kathos epen ha theos hati, just as God said that, and kathos gegreptai, just as it is written. And so, in comparison to 1 Corinthians, which uses the introductory formula around 12 times, which obviously it is a longer letter, right? So that to consider. Paul only uses the formula 5 times in 2 Corinthians, and he also introduces it much less formally and via allusion for the most part. And so this Old Testament usage would again correspond to a descriptive usage of the genitive, and therefore a metaphorical use of Jeremiah, rather than a just as it is written that then the word which was spoken will come to pass, something like that. And so this passage again seems to support a more single covenant Israeli conclusion than any other. And so basically the idea is that 2 Corinthians is less formal in its references, 1 Corinthians is more formal. So that gives us an indication of how Paul uses the Old Testament, right? Now, we're getting to the conclusion, right? There are only 2 possible options when viewing the 2 Corinthians 3:6. It either demonstrates the content of his message, or it's talking about the conduct in which he ministered the message. Now, the author, which is George Gunn, and myself have argued for the latter with robust support via our 6 questions. And so if you take into account all the other uses of the New Covenant in the New Testament, this conclusion fits the context also well. Hopefully you learn from this passage that it does not necessitate New Covenant participation in the church. And we will soon continue the next part of our series, and that one will be deeper than ever. And that's going to be after a little bit of a hiatus, as I said before, right? But the next one, just as a surprise, is Hebrews. So that's going to be a whole thing. And there's going to be some interesting conclusions that we're going to come to because I already finished the PowerPoint. But yeah. Can you go back to the Acts 18, 1-8 slide? All right. Yep, this one. All right. But yeah. But by the way, if I actually like if the stream stops for some reason, I don't think it will, but if it stops, whoever Janet, whoever, don't stop the stream. Don't stop the stream because I want it to come back. It's I still got more to say. But yeah, that's basically the basically the end of the presentation. Now, okay, we got AVBTM says, "Hi, bro. What's up? I'm anti-dispensational in the case of salvation." I mean, I would agree. I mean, that's not an actual criticism of dispensationalism. That's just common sense, right? Because that's not an. I'm just gonna be honest. That's not an actual critique of dispensationalism. That's a critique of a sect that came out of misinterpretations of classical dispensationalists like Schaeffer and Schofield and Bullinger. I don't even think Bullinger taught that, right? So it's like that's not an actual critique, but I agree with you on that. Didn't Schaeffer dump the New Covenant view? Do you know what he held after that? I think years later he dropped the 2 New Covenant view. I think he just held to either the partial fulfillment or the fulfillment in part, which is the participation view. Probably the participation view, right? I think it's definitely the most common. It just depends on how you articulate it. Hi all, and then you got someone with a heavily Japanese name there, which, hey, what's up? The chart for dispensationalism gives signs at end times before the rapture. Is that right? Doesn't seem right. Yeah, I don't agree. I mean, okay, if you want me to go back to the actual thing, right? So it says, all right, where does it say it? Okay, that one. Yeah, so basically, you got Jesus' offer of a messianic kingdom to Israel. I agree. But then God deals with the Gentiles, and there's signs of the end times. That I disagree with. I don't think that that's accurate. Now, of course, you could say, oh, well, it's apostasy, and apostasy is before. That is true, but I don't think it's something you can chart, right? Like even Paul said in his day that there was severe apostasy. So I think it's just a statement of fact before the church ends, rather than something you like can empirically observe, right? It's just meant to be talking about faithfulness in the last days. That's the point. Because you can't know the rapture. You don't know when it's going to take place, right? I don't think it's going to take place soon because I don't think there's a Babylon rebuilt, but I could be wrong about that. Seems like the context solves this one. Yeah, I mean, the literally, like, just look at the context. 2 Corinthians 3:6. Is it talking about descriptive, objective? Why does he use metaphors? Because it's not the only metaphor he uses. The New Covenant is not the only metaphor he uses. He uses 8 metaphors. So you got to understand those to understand why the New Covenant is used as a metaphor, right? And now, of course, it doesn't detract the fact that the New Covenant is a literal covenant that will be fulfilled. That's not a problem. The point is that it's used as a metaphor, right? Just like all the other things are literal things that took place, but they are used as a metaphor. Now, of course, I've been doing this sign a lot. I know for a fact that Mike is going to call me a shill and a Freemason, right? Like I already know, man. I can't help it, man. I'm too much of a shill. What is it? Sovereign grace for the win. Sovereign grace for the win. Oh, what? I think that's Tyler. What up? Seems like the most difficult part is understanding what they knew. Yeah. I would guess this is my guess. Not saying this is inspired. It could be illuminated. I don't know. I think my guess is that they probably suspected it would come within their lifetime. Like, I think even Paul said that we wait for the Savior from heaven, right? So he even thought that Jesus could come back in his lifetime. Now, of course, if you're a preterist, you believe he did, which is a problem. But of course, obviously, they had that suspicion. They thought the kingdom would come. They thought the tribulation would happen, right? So they're like, what the heck? Why you didn't even come back in 40 years? Well, it's going to take longer than that, Now you used my Amel. You used my Amel chart. Yeah, it's a hilarious chart, dude. Yeah, it's a hilarious chart. It's the cross to the explosion. It's base though. It's really good. But dang, the unfortunate part is that there were a lot of questions in the other one, right? There were a lot of questions in the other one. I couldn't get to those questions. I kind of want to get to those questions now because I felt bad that I couldn't answer them. I felt bad that I couldn't answer them before. And people might have had questions or concerns during that. So, but I mean, we could also go over some of the more difficult stuff, right? This is a complex, convoluted slide. I didn't want to make the slide so heavy, but I kind of had to because I didn't want to fill it up with too much. I didn't want to fill it up with I didn't want to, spend too much time on this, but the idea is actually interesting because most people think Darby held to a no relationship view. I think he probably did. I think he probably held to a no relationship view. I think that's he didn't really talk about the new covenant much, but when he did, he always made sure to say that it was about Israel in the millennium. But it's difficult to tell, right? And especially since he's kind of he's the first systematizer of dispensationalism. It's he's not standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. So it can be, so he can say some stuff that might seem inconsistent, and that's just expected. And then, of course, most dispensations hold to the participation view. Now, when I say participation, I don't mean partial fulfillment. That's a progressive dispensationalism idea of partial fulfillment of the new covenant. Most dispensations would not go that far, and they would just simply say, look, the church receives blessings from the new covenant via Christ, who is the mediator of the new covenant. He gives those blessings to them, and that's fine. But when you say it's partially fulfilled, I don't think that that's accurate. But of course, you have to think that the church is prophesied in the Old Testament, and that kind of stuff. And I think most dispensations would disagree with that. And of course, the no relationship view is the one that I hold now. Of course, I'll eventually have to give an actual presentation, and I'll write a paper, and I'll deal with Jeremy Thomas's thoughts on that eventually. And so who knows, I could change my mind on it. But for now, I think this is the most exegetical based on the text. You did pretty well. The Greek references are pretty useless to me. Well, they're I try not to go too much into the Greek because they're not like, they're cool and all, right? If you just want to sound smart, but they're actually not relevant for the most part. They're just to establish like the exegetical side of it, because you usually, when you're doing exegesis, you usually have to go into the Greek to at least a little bit, right? And that's what the authors did, and that's what I'm presenting. But the next presentation on Hebrews we're going to do is he did a lot of Greek, like a lot of Greek. And I think that I'm just going to stick with the English on that, right? Because I don't want to bore my audience with going into my horrible pronunciations and stuff. So there's that. Now, is single covenant Israel only really new? I don't think so. I mean, because you could say, here's the thing, everyone has always held to some view. Whatever view you have of a passage, at least if you're not like off the walls, right? But whatever view you hold to a passage, and whatever systematized idea you have, right? Even if it's uncommon, someone has held to it in history. You can always find someone in history that held to something like what you believe, right? And single covenant Israel only there's always been people that said it, right? Like, the only problem is that there's just been a lot of assumptions and covenant theology baggage and that kind of stuff that has prevented exegesis in many ways. And of course, you could be covenant theology and disagree. That's not the point of what I'm getting into. The point is that dispensationalists have covenantal leanings, right, in a lot of areas, and especially if they're free grace as well, or especially if they're not free grace. That's what I mean. Not because I want Greek to be useless to me. I would love to know. Maybe you or layman could explain some basic Greek principles. I'm not qualified to be a Greek teacher. I could explain some things, some principles about grammar. I could recommend you books like Intermediate Greek Grammar by Daniel Wallace. He has multiple volumes. Advanced, I think he has Advanced Greek Grammar. There are good grammar books by people that are not even free grace, as well as Zane Hodges. He was an actual scholar. John Niemala is another scholar. But I'm not qualified to be a teacher of that kind of stuff. But layman definitely knows that stuff a lot more than me, so I would recommend speaking to him. Covenant theology also for the win. Yeah. But Greek is interesting because there are some things in the Greek, not saying this hides the meaning, but there are some things in the Greek that can give you insight into some exegesis, especially with some passages. And I think that's fair. The reason why I asked about the view being new is because I wonder where Darby and Schaeffer were at with the thought, if they ever entertained it. Well, here's the thing about Schaeffer. I don't know if Schaeffer, because here's the thing about the two new covenants view. The two new covenants view is basically an artificial derivative. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to admit it. Two new covenants view is an artificial derivation, where they try to maintain the distinction between Israel and the church artificially. And they say, oh, well, that's not the same new covenant. It's a different new covenant. It's kind of not really naturally derived from the text. There's no reason to think that it's a new covenant. There's no reason to think that the church had its own covenant, because all of the references to the new covenant are explicitly about like in contrast to the old covenant, or explicitly mentions Jeremiah 31. So I think that that's not really fair. None of the apostles would have understood that as well, right? When they first heard it in Matthew 26. So it's not really naturally derived. So I'm not ragging on Schaeffer. I do appreciate Schaeffer. I just, I think that wasn't a good direction he went in, but I think that he might have dabbled with it. I just think he didn't think it was exegetical, right? Now Darby, I think he probably held it, right? That's what I'm saying. Um, yeah, and then the significance of it, hermeneutical issues. Yeah, this one, yeah, Darby and Schofield did law work, not sure about Schaeffer, but these guys aren't morons. Yeah, of course, they aren't morons, right? They're genuinely trying to see the text for what it says and to exegete it. Right? Like I know that Darby and Schofield, a lot of the early dispensations, they did not go to formal college or Bible college, but they still knew Greek very well, right? So they're not dumb. However, but now I don't know too much about Schaeffer's past though, but you know, the thing with the objective or descriptive thing, this one, is this the strongest proof? I don't think it is, right? But I mean, it's good evidence, right? Like the only other time you have ministers in Second Corinthians, like that word is ministers of righteousness, and that's clearly not, that's a descriptive, right? Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily say that it's talking about the same thing, but it's like, well, I mean, it makes sense, right? You have angel of light. It's also a descriptive genitive. It's an angel. It's an angel light, right? Uh, it is a light-like angel, but it's not actually the angel of light, right? So, stuff like that is important to consider. Who's the us? See, now this part of it, I will say, it was kind of boring. I mean, like this is what the author wrote down. I'm just like, okay, I'll write it down. But yeah, most of this stuff is just not like, I think it's to establish a conclusion, but I think I could have told you the conclusion a lot simpler, right? But yeah, I mean, if there's stuff you need to go over, that would be good to know. But or questions to ask about the actual presentation. But other than that, I mean, we're basically done with the presentation. Now this one was like, I struggled to find different things to pull up, about the steps. Because here's the problem, right? Most people are like, and I'm gonna be honest, most people end up lordship, Amil, and not Calvinist, but more like Armenian, So it's really lordship plus Amil plus Armenian, and it's like, you're cooked at that point, because look, you believe that you have to repent of your sins to be saved, and you say that if you don't have works, you lose your salvation. And what's worse is that you don't even believe in a future 1,000-year kingdom, right? How cooked can you possibly be, man? Okay. Now, of course, the most cooked is when you're full preterist. So no, okay. Honestly, Stacy Tuberville, okay, I Tuberville, however you want to say it, he might be the most cooked heretic on YouTube. He's full preterist, plus Unitarian, plus lordship, plus believes you can lose your salvation. How absolutely demolished can you be in your theology? I mean, like, even Sean Griffin is not a full preterist, right? Like, you got to give him props for that. At least he's not full preterist. Like, at least that. But like Stacy Tuberville is like, you're Unitarian too, and you don't believe in 1,000 years. Like, dang, man. I watched the debates with James Shimoon. I wanted to react to that, but man, it was, Lord, like, you got lordship, and then it goes over to free grace, and then the unfortunate truth is that someone like Donnie, right, who I wish he was more consistent, but it's fine. He's free grace and he's premill, but he's covenant, and it's got to go, man. The fire, the axe is laid to the root, and the fire, and everything that doesn't bear fruit is chopped into the fire. But yeah, Stacy Tuberville is definitely a comedy act, man. But yeah. Yeah, and this one too. This was like a lot of Greek that I didn't need to go into. I wish I wish that like this wasn't that bad, but again, it's just Greek heavy, right? Like the phrasing, it's all Greek to me. That's literally what this was, right? It's literally just most people think this is nonsense, right? But again, I think it does support the conclusion that the author is trying to make, so it's relevant to bring up, right, to give you some context. And of course, if anyone wants this slides, and if anyone wants any of the slides, I'm free to give them out if you want to look over them further. Um, but yeah, other than that, let me see. Uh, all right. Um, because actually, with the now, I will say I think the actual challenge to the single covenant Israel only. There's not many, but there are a few, right? I'm not saying there's none, but there are a few, right? We're basically Hebrews. Hebrews is um Hebrews is a difficult one. I'm not saying that to undermine the position. I'm just saying how it is, right? Um right? Um basically like Hebrews is difficult because it talks about the law and it talks about the law and it talks about that in contrast to the new covenant. It's like, okay, well, is it talking about Christ's superiority over the law, or is it talking about the new covenant over the law, and in what way do relate to the new covenant and that kind of stuff. um and if it's like, well, if you're single covenant Israel only, you kind of have to believe that the law is still in effect, but it's no longer a means of sanctification, it's a means of cursing, right? That's probably what you'd have to believe if you were Israel only, which is fine, but most people don't believe that. um yeah, do you have every PowerPoint saved? Yes, I have every PowerPoint saved. I have all of them saved on two computers because I have to use two computers to present them and to make them. So, um, uh, so there's that. But yeah, basically, uh, I saved. I even have the other videos. I even started uploading the videos of this presentation series to my actual channel so that I could just have it as a resource. And Charles allows it because he's, you know, I literally present my papers on his channel, so it makes sense. Um, you know, uh, but yeah, Hebrews is a difficult one. That's why that one's probably gonna be the longest one we've done so far. This one wasn't that long, right? Well, it was long, but it wasn't like, super long. That one probably will be the longest we've done so far. The other ones were kind of like, you know, were pretty standard presentations, but that one is gonna probably take an hour, maybe more than an hour, to actually go into. Okay. But I mean, because in Hebrews 8 it says that the new covenant was established on better promises, and you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that it's established? Does it established means it's in force? If it's in force, does that mean that the blessings flow to the church necessarily? Okay, well, if you want to say that, which blessings, right? Which access, which stuff, that kind of nature. Um, so yeah, but but I mean, basically, if there's no questions further, right? I think we're basically, uh, um, it's basically good to end it here, right? And and as always, right? My hair was absolutely just like horrible for this because I didn't prepare it at all, but it's fine. So Yeah, yeah. Um, uh, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned some more and the view of the authors as well more. This is more of a presentation for the book than anything, and endorsement of it. It's called An Introduction to the New Covenant. One of the writers is Grant Gilly, so you can identify it by that. And I mean, you could buy it on Amazon or something like that. But yeah, it basically presents the view pretty well, and that's what I'm presenting. So Ashley Myers, what up? Hopefully, if you weren't here, you could go back see the presentation. But we're basically done now, and so uh, I'll talk to you guys later. Just watch more content and bless.